Hello, in this video I'm going to show you the Philidor with c6. After the moves e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, e5, we got a Philidor. Knight f3, the most played move. We go knight bd7, bishop c4, bishop e7, castle, castle. And here, okay, white has several useful prophylactic moves. And there are rook e1, a4, and h3. We're going to see a4. I want to mention that if white goes rook e1, which is actually the most played move in this position, again we can go for this plan with c6. And we are threatening b5, so white has to go a4. And then after a5, it will transpose to the lines we're going to discuss. So after a4, we go c6. The other option, which was discussed in some other video, was e takes d4. But what we want with this move is, first of all, to prepare e takes d4 in better conditions. We still want to do that, but we can do it now, and c6 will be more useful. Or we can first include a5 and then go for e takes d4. And of course, this c6 is a very typical move for the Philidor. It controls this d5 square, b5 square. So at the right moment, we'll even have ideas to play d5. Also, the queen can go to c7, a5 if necessary. Well, we don't really want to move the queen. And here we're going to see many moves by white. a5, h3, bishop h3, sorry, h3, bishop a2, queen e2, bishop e3, and finally rook e1, which is the most played move. a5 is a logical move, and it gains more space on the queen side. And here we are recommending the more direct approach with e takes d4. There is another option which I like, and that is rook b8 to just prepare b5 afterwards, so that we are able to take on b6 with the a pawn. But e takes d4 is more direct, and we are opening the center. And here, of course, we need to cover both knight d4 and queen d4. Queen d4 is a possible capture, and white wants to follow up with bishop f4 and rook d1 to put pressure on the d6 pawn. And we want to play knight e5, but knight e5 right now is not possible, so we need to prepare it with queen c7, and then knight e5 is there. Once we get knight e5, we're going to be able to trade some pieces, and also we'll free up the c8 bishop. So it's a very desirable idea. White is trying to stop this move knight e5 by also developing the pieces. And again, so this is against knight e5, and there is some pressure on the d6 pawn. And of course, we need to do something quickly before white is in time to play rook a1. So knight h5 to remove the bishop from the h2 b8 diagonal. Just to mention here, don't fall for knight c5. This is a big blunder because of queen c5 and we lose a knight. So pay attention to the details. Instead, we want to get rid of this bishop from the diagonal. Let's say bishop e3, the most active square for the bishop. And now finally we manage knight e5, and you can see it's quite a big deal that we brought the knight here. We have ideas to take on f3 and spoil white's pawn structure, but also knight takes e4 could be an option. White goes, of course, white doesn't want to take on e5 because it would make our play very easy. It would be a symmetrical position, but then after we take back, the knight could even jump to f4 and so on. So white avoids this trade. Bishop e2 is played. Okay, just to show you, knight e5. Yeah, this is not very ambitious. It was played, but I wouldn't consider it during the game. Queen d1, and as I was saying, knight f4. Now the knight on f4 is strong. The position is about equal, but black went on to win a good game by outplaying his opponent. In Staiva against Yu Yang-gi, played in Bill 2022, black was higher rated, and I think he was quite happy with the position he got from the opening. So I think if white wants to play for a draw, that's not the way to do it. Bishop e2 is white is retreating the bishop, but now is defending the knight, and also he doesn't want to allow knight f3 to weaken his pawn structure. And now we go bishop g4. The thing is that white has some space advantage here, so it's good for us to trade pieces, and that's why we go bishop g4. Queen d1, again, white needs to defend this knight on f3, and here we can start trading pieces, bishop f3. Just to mention that it's also fine to go back with the knight f6, because the knight did his job on h5 and now is more active on f6, of course. But probably the easiest is to just take on f3, bishop takes, knight f3, queen f3, and now we shouldn't forget about, we shouldn't leave this knight on the rim, just bring it back into play. And it's true that white has more space, but we traded two pair of pieces, minor pieces, and I think black has an easy play here. White space advantage is not really felt, and we have ideas such as b5. Always a good idea to push on the queen side, but also rook f8 to just activate the rook, or knight d7. The position is about equal. Let's go back. Knight d4 looks more natural to me, and also white is threatening knight f5, but of course it's our turn, so we can easily parry this. In here we going for knight c5, attacking the e4 pawn. In practice, actually, knight e5 was played more often, but there white can go either bishop e2 or bishop a2, and both moves with idea to go f4. So even here, this idea is to go f4 and dislodge the knight from e5. That's why we prefer knight c5, because we are putting pressure on e4 straight away. And now we're going to see queen f3 and rook e1. Just to mention that if white defends the pawn with f3, this also looks possible, but then we can go d5. And we'll get an isolated pawn on d5, but white played this move f3 and weakened a little bit the king's position. So black was fine in that line. Now let's see queen f3, just to defend the pawn like this. Here we can equalize immediately with the typical tactical strike, knight c4, knight takes c4. And here the most precise is d5. Knight f6, let's say, and then bishop f6. And you can see both the white knight on d4 and the bishop on c4 are under attack. We're going to take back the piece with an equal position. Rook e1. Very principled to defend on e4. And here we go rook e8. This is a useful move, always a useful move. We want to add more pressure on the e4 pawn later on, after bishop f8, of course. And here we're going to consider a6, queen f3, and even bishop f1. a6 is a very concrete move, and white is trying to create some weaknesses on the queen side. We should always consider this move and at least to know how to react about it. White is counting on the weakness of the c6 pawn. So here we go queen c7, just to address this weakness, defending the pawn. And white takes on b7. He has to now, otherwise maybe we can go b5 or even take the a6 pawn. So a takes b7 is there, and queen b7. Okay, white managed to weaken our queen side a little bit. a7 pawn could be a weakness, and c6 pawn, but also it won't be easy to develop the bishop because b pawn could be hanging. And also here it's very important. We have the bishop on c8, which is covering the f5 square. We definitely don't want to allow the white knight to land on f5. Useful move here would be to just continue our previous plan with bishop f8 and then put pressure on e4. Let's go back. Queen f3. Activating the queen, overprotecting the e4 pawn. It's never a bad idea to overprotect some important square. So here it is. And here we can play bishop g4. It comes with tempo. We want to develop the bishop anyway, but just the queen was more active on f3. So after white goes queen g3, well, this bishop on g4 now is kind of hanging. It's not really attack, but we can retreat it to d7. And very important, defend the c6 pawn. And now we want to go b5. And with this maneuver, bishop g4, bishop d7, um, we managed to bring the white queen to g3 so that um, e4 could be exposed in the future. Bishop f1. This is what the computer is suggesting. Well, the bishop was quite exposed on f4, on c4. So just to drop it back, but I think it's a bit passive. So we just continue our plan to attack the e4 pawn and open up the rook. White goes f3. Now, finally, e4 is safely defended. And we go bishop d7 to complete the development and prepare the b5 push. Here I want to mention, in these positions, we don't want to go d5 because white has e5. Notice the rook on e1. And white would get an advantage in this kind of positions. So we go bishop d7 instead. And we want to go b5. If at some point white goes bishop e3, then d5 is possible because white doesn't have e5 anymore. So black has a good position, I think. Let me just show you a sample line. Bishop g5, b5. We simply continue our plan. White takes on b6, queen b6 even, hinting at the pin on the diagonal. And now, let's say white doubles our pawns, but it's not. We're not worried about this. On the other hand, white has weaknesses on the dark squared bishop, dark squares. So b2 is hanging, and also there is a pin on a7 g1 diagonal. Already black has an initiative here. Knight e6 could be a threat, or even to push f5 to open up the game. This was a5. Now let's see h3. As I mentioned before, this is one of the good prophylactic moves that white has in the position. It's always useful to control the g4 square, and here white wants to go bishop b3 without worrying about knight g4. And then if we take on d4, white can take with the bishop on d4. And it would be slightly better for white. So now is the right time to take on d4. Just to show you white's idea again, a5, it's perhaps too slow because of bishop e3, as I mentioned. So a5 is a move that we want to play anyway to fix the queen side, but here it's slow because it doesn't address white's idea. Instead, we just take on d4. Queen takes d4. Okay, now it makes sense to take with the queen since white safely secured this knight on f3. If white goes knight d4, then knight c5, rook e1, a5, it transposes to rook e8 at 8 move. So queen d4, of course, having the move h3, now white wants to go bishop f4 and then attack on d6. We won't have ideas with knight h5 because the bishop can drop back to h2. So you can see that h3 move is very useful. And here we're playing knight c5. And we want to go bishop e6 to trade these bishops. And if white goes knight f4, then we go knight e6 instead and trade the knight. So white goes rook d1. In this line, white is trying to skip the move rook e1. So just rook d1 with the idea bishop f4 and pressure on d6. And then after bishop f4, knight d6 would be too late because white can take and then just take on d6. So this is a white's idea. We go bishop e6. This is our usual plan, and then our next moves could be a5, rook e8, and so on. White goes bishop f4, of course, finally attacking d6. It's too early to go a5. a5 is a move that makes sense. Like white has several useful moves. We also have several useful moves. But here a5 fails to bishop c4, queen c4, and b5. Then black is fine. So this doesn't work for white. Bishop f4 instead, just to complete the development, put pressure on d6. And here it's important to go a5 to just to fix the queen side. But now we'll have to consider bishop d6, of course. And also the bishop retreats to bishop g3 or even bishop h2, the more refined bishop h2. First of all, we start with bishop h2, which is a prophylactic move. But in some lines, in the lines with bishop g3, the bishop was hanging there in some forced line, which we're going to see in a moment. So now tactical tricks don't work anymore. And here we're recommending knight e8. Usually we don't want to retreat with the pieces like this. But here it's justified because we are defending a d6 pawn. And we want to continue with queen b6, or even if white moves the c4 bishop away, for example, to f1, we could consider even ideas to go f5. White goes b3, just to consolidate the queen side. If knight d2, here we have queen b6. So just to follow the plan. So let's say b3, now we can take on c4. Anyway, it's good to trade these bishops, queen c4, and finally queen b6, getting out of the pin on the d file. And instead we want to bring maybe the rook to d8. There is also an idea to go queen b4. And yeah, for example, after rook d8, we can follow up with knight f6 to bring the knight into place, since d6 square would be, d6 pawn would be well defended. And I don't see a clear way for white to open up the position here. So ideally, white would like to take advantage of our knight on e8 and open up the position, but there is no way to do it. Let's go back. Bishop d6. Of course, we need to take this move into account. What happens if white just takes the pawn? Well, it will lead to equality, and here it's important to take with the queen. Queen d6, bishop d6. And now the c4 bishop is hanging, so white is forced to take bishop e6. So this is, all this is a forced sequence of moves. We will save the dark squared bishop with bishop c7. Now this bishop is going to be strong. At the same time, the e6 bishop is under attack, and of course, e4 pawn is attacked. Um, Bishop f5, this was played in a couple of games. Obviously, white wants to defend the e4 pawn. If instead white goes bishop c4, then rook a8 is fine for black. The e4 pawn is attacked here. So that's why white goes for bishop f5. But here the bishop will be exposed even to g6. First of all, we bring the rook to e8, and this is a bit better than rook f e8. This was played in the games. It's not so easy to notice the difference. Actually, this is many times quite a big question, which rook to put on a file. Here, rook a8 is the better move. Now we're threatening g6, and also it will be very important that in the line we will have bishop d8. So that's why we bring the rook into play. Rook e1, well, white is defending the e4 pawn, and white is going to counter g6 with e5. This is the idea. Otherwise, the bishop is kind of trapped. We go for g6, e5. This is forced. This is what white was counting on. G takes f5, e takes f6, and here it's that detail I was telling you about. Bishop d8. We have this extra option compared to the lines where black played rook f8. There, this option was not available. But now we can just attack the f6 pawn straight away. Of course, we want to get rid of that pawn as soon as possible to level the material balance and also to activate the bishop on the long diagonal. And here black has a good endgame. So bishop d6 leads to a forced line, but black is fine. We shouldn't worry about it. And now finally, let's see bishop g3, which looks more natural than bishop h2. The bishop can sometimes be exposed there, but it could also be more active. Sometimes, let's say, it has available the h4 square. And also, on the long term, the white king has the h2 square available. And this is the main move. Now white wants to take on e6, and the bishop is not exposed on f4 as before. And here there starts a series of forced moves. Bishop c4, queen c4. And now a surprising idea works. We don't need to go back 98 like before. But now b5 works. It seemed that b5 square was well under white's control. But here it just works for tactical reasons. The e4 pawn is hanging. And of course, with this pawn break, we change the character of the position. There will be some exchanges. So white takes on b5, we take back, c takes b5. Queen b5, of course, white needs to take this pawn because otherwise the pawn will start pushing b4, and white cannot allow this. The other capture, knight b5, knight c4, Again, we can see it's important. This line only works if the bishop is on g3, because now we are threatening the bishop. With the bishop on h2, white would be an extra tempo up. So let's say bishop f4, queen b6, attacking on f2, bishop e3, queen b7. But now the knight on e4 is quite strong, defending the pawn on d6. Also, white had to bring the bishop to e3, so it's not possible to attack the d6 pawn anymore. And black is doing fine here. So let's see the other capture. I think it makes more sense to take with the queen on b5. So here it doesn't really matter how we take on e4, but we need to take on e4, that's for sure. Knight e4, but knight c4 is also the same thing. The knights will get traded. Now white has to take because we're threatening both knight c3 and knight g3. So knight e4, knight e4, bishop f4. The bishop is more active here, so white goes for this square. And now we can just activate the rook with rook e8. Later on, we can decide on bishop f8 or bishop f6 or bishop f8. And the position is balanced, and there was a correspondence game, Greller versus Fursign, played in ICCF 2023, and they agreed on a draw after c3, consolidating move, bishop f8. Now the pawn on c3, it doesn't make so much sense to go bishop f6. Rook a2, just to defend b2 and maybe on a longer term attack on a5. And black played knight c5 and they agreed on a draw. So the position is balanced here. Notice that after this b5 break, the position and the pawn structure changed completely. So this was h3. Now let's take a look at bishop a2. The bishop is safer on a2. I mean, it's not so exposed like it was on c4, so this can be a useful move. On the other hand, it's not clear that the bishop was required on a2. We continue just the same with e takes d4. Now, if queen d4, there is knight c5 followed by a5. And if knight d4, then the same knight c5, attacking on e4. And after rook e1, a5, it transposes. Another move here is queen e2, with the idea to put the rook on d1. So instead of having the queen on d1 and rook on e1, which takes one move, white wants to spend two moves to get queen e2 and rook d1, and this is a possible setup. But here it's not good, because we can play the rook on e8 and then the queen will be misplaced on e2. So first of all, we need to open up the e file. E takes d4, knight d4, and now rook e8. And you see that white is going to experience problems here because the queen is just misplaced on the e file. Of course, now we want to continue bishop f8 and d5. And it's simple plan. White has to do something about this. Bishop a2, it's useful so that d5 will not be with tempo. White can go, let's say, bishop e3, but again, we go bishop f8 or even bishop f4. Again, bishop f8 and black is preferable in both cases. So let's say bishop a2. Of course, we go bishop f8, and now there is the idea to go d5 or knight c5, both moves to attack the e4 pawn. And white needs to do something about this. The queen on e2 is misplaced. We're going to see here f3 or queen f3. f3 is an attempt to just solidify this e4 pawn, and then white wants to go queen f2, trying to get some play on the f file. Of course, we go d5 while the queen is still on the e file. Here, white avoids the pin with queen f2. Here, probably the easiest solution, because now there is some tension in the center, but the easiest solution is to just clarify the situation right away and take on e4. And here white wants to take with the knight, because once the knights will be traded, then he wants to attack the f7 pawn. We're fine with this, so knight takes e4, f takes e4, and now white is attacking f7 big time. The only way to stop this is to go knight f6 just to cover the f file. At the same time, e4 is under attack. White is playing bishop g5 to pin the knight and threatening to take on f6. As you can see now, the position became quite sharp. It opened up. We're taking the e4 pawn, attacking the d4 knight. Here the position simplified, and it's about equal. It can simplify to an equal endgame after bishop f6, queen f6. We want to trade the queens. Bishop f7. White is trying to be tricky. We cannot take with the king because we would lose the queen. White could go, let's say, queen d2, and then we would be pinned. But we go king h8. Now white has to take on f6. We take with the pawn. c3 to just defend the knight, and bishop c5. And okay, the position is about equal. Also, I want to say that instead of just grabbing the pawn, it was possible to go bishop c5. But taking the pawn looks more reasonable. So this is f3. It can be a bit dangerous, but not really, because if you know this line, it leads to nothing for white. And in most of the games, white played queen f3 to just avoid the pin on the e file. But here we can already see that white strategy failed big time, because he had to move the queen twice in the opening without achieving anything. So queen e2, queen f3, and black feels good here with an extra tempo. Now knight c5 is quite effective to attack this e4 pawn. Most of the game actually saw knight e5, which perhaps is also fine because of the extra tempo. You know, when you get a tempo for free, then everything works. But I like knight c5 more. Bishop g5 to just pin this knight, and like this to defend the e4 pawn. And here we can force the issue with the h6. It's also possible to go a5 to fix the queen side. This is a very typical move. This is also fine. But let's say h6. White, what to do? White is doubling our pawns. Queen f6, queen f6, gf6. Now e4 is under attack. So it makes sense to secure e4. And okay, we have the bishop pair, but white is hoping to take advantage of our damaged pawn structure on the king side. And here I like this positional pawn sacrifice, f5. So this was not forced, but we doing this to activate our pieces, especially the dark squared bishop. So white takes the pawn, and now d5. We're shutting off the a2 bishop. Again, we have this very nice pawn chain c6 and d5, limiting the bishop, the knight, and also we open up the e-file. So we want to play bishop d7 to connect the rooks. Bishop g7 is there. Now, since we don't have the f6 pawn anymore, our bishop will be very active on the long diagonal. So just for a mere pawn, we have plenty of compensation here. This was queen e2. Bishop e3 is a move. And it makes sense because white wants to, if we take on d4, white wants to recapture on d4 with the bishop. But this was rarely seen because white is not controlling the g4 square, and we can just go knight g4 and attacking this bishop. And now white has to do something about the bishop. Of course, it's a bit unpleasant for white to immediately be forced to remove the bishop. So we're going to see bishop d2 and bishop c1. Bishop d2 trying to claim that the bishop is at least doing something or is developed on d2. On the other hand, now d4 square is less protected. So we can take on d4, knight d4, and knight c5. The idea is to go bishop f6, or even, if it works, knight e4 and d5. Okay, all the time when you sacrifice on e4, you have to make sure that you get back the piece with d5. So you need to calculate the consequences precisely. Okay, white goes h3. So white has to include h3 after all. And here we can take advantage of white's bishop on d2 and to play bishop f6 with a counterattack on the d4 knight. The best square for the knight is on e2. We're going to see knight d2 and also knight c6 to grab a pawn. Knight c6 may look tempting, and we always need to see what happens if the opponent is going for a pawn grab. We just take back and then hg4. And here, okay, we can take back the pawn with bishop c3 and knight e4, but it's much better to first include bishop e5, introducing the threat of queen h4. And if white parries it with g5, then we can take on c3 and knight e4. And the same goes for g3, then bishop c3 and knight e4. And like this, we want to weaken white's position a little bit. Knight d2. Now knight goes to e5. Bishop a2. What else? And here again, it's useful to fix the pawns on the queen side with this typical move a5. We want to go bishop e6 or even b6. Knight g6 will probably have to go if white goes f4. We got the position is a bit unusual for the Philidor, but black is doing fine. And it's also quite unlikely to reach this position in practice. I don't think. White is so eager to play bishop e3 and then go back with the bishop. Bishop c1 is another move, offering a move repetition. But of course, white can change the plans later on. So we can go knight f6 if we really want to, but we may as well take on d4. Knight d4. Here, queen d4 is not justified because we can go knight g5. And it's a good thing when we can bring a knight to e5 in this setup with knight f3 and queen d4. We're going to trade a pair of light pieces. So black is immediately fine here. Knight d4, let's say, knight c5. We are preparing knight e4 and d5. White probably has to kick away the knight with h3. Knight goes back to f6, attacking on e4. And now rook e1, defending the e4 pawn. We go a5 and this transposes. But okay, bishop e3, it's quite a rare occurrence. And now, let's see. Rook e1. Finally, this is the main move. One of those useful prophylactic moves that white has at his disposal. Reinforcing the e4 pawn, also the center. The rook is active there. And here we play a5. We want to fix the queen side first, not allowing white to push a5. We're making sure that later on when we get a knight to c5, white is not able to play b4. And also now we want to see how white will put his pieces. And here we're going to consider b3, bishop a2, bishop f1, and finally h3. h3 obviously is the main move. Is very useful prophylactic move. b3 has the idea to fianchetto the bishop and also sometimes to go bishop a3. I don't trust this bishop a3 idea so much, but it's possible to put pressure on d6 and e7. But here we can just follow our plan. So after this move a5, anyway, we want to take on d4. Here it works. It worked just fine. And we're going to see queen d4 and knight d4 here. Queen d4 has the drawback that now white has some weaknesses on the dark squares. F2 pawn could potentially be weak because white played rook e1, and also the knight on c3 is loose since white played b3. So that's why knight e5 is possible. We're sacrificing a pawn, but as I mentioned, on a very short turn, this white has these weaknesses on the dark squares, and we take advantage of it. Knight c5 is not so good here. This would be our typical move, but white can mount some pressure on our position after bishop a3, bishop e6, and then take on c5. And white gets a good pawn structure. So we want to avoid this, but 95 is the move I really like. And here we're going to see the more cautious bishop e2, and of course we need to consider what happens if white just takes the pawn. First of all, with 95, taking the pawn, d takes e5. Well, now if white goes queen e3 or queen d8 and doesn't take the pawn, I think black is completely fine. So only queen e5 can be ambitious. But then we can go knight g4, hitting the queen with tempo. And here white already is has to find some only moves to stay in the game. His position is rather dangerous. The only move is queen f4. Queen g3 would just be bad because of bishop h4. Then f2 is one of the weaknesses I mentioned. And obviously queen h5 is also a bad square because of queen d4 with double attack on f2 and c3, and also the a1 rook is hanging, so this is disastrous. Queen f4, and here bishop d6. We are attacking the queen again. White is forced to give back the pawn with e5, knight e5. And yeah, we got back the pawn with a very promising position. I think white still has to find some very precise moves here to stay in the game. I think bishop h3 is one of them. But just to notice that rook e5 is a blunder, because after queen c4, queen c7, white loses the rook, and so loses an exchange. So this was 95. White is better off to avoid this pawn grabbing stuff for now. So bishop e2 is a more cautious move. And here we can go knight fg4 with the idea to play bishop f6 and take advantage of the long diagonal, of the weaknesses there. White has to cover this long diagonal now and plays bishop b2. And we just follow our plan with bishop f6. The queen has to move, but where to move? Queen d2 looks like the best square for the queen. And here we can release a little bit of tension with knight f3. Actually, in practice, they tried queen b6 here to attack on f2, but white can just defend with rook f1, and it's not clear what black achieved with this. So that's why knight f3, bishop f3. And now bishop g5 is a good move. We want to bring the knight to e5, but we also want to make sure that white doesn't have f4 on a longer term. That's why it's good to remove the queen from supporting f4. So let's say queen d1, now knight e5, bishop e2, and notice that here white doesn't have f4 anymore. So this is fine for us, and we need to act quickly before white renews that threat. And we go f5, we're breaking the center, and I think black will soon take over here. Somehow it feels that white's opening strategy failed. The more logical recapture is with the knight here, and this is also played more often. And now knight e5. It's important to go here because if we go knight c5, white has bishop a3 with pressure. There are always ideas to take on c5 and change the pawn structure. So we go knight e5, bishop f1, and rook e8. Again, this is always a useful move. We want to see how white proceeds. And on the long term, of course, we want to go bishop f8 to activate the rook. Here we're going to see bishop a3 and h3. Bishop a3 has the idea to go queen d2 and rook a d1. And then, of course, the whole point is to put pressure on the d6 pawn. We go queen b6, and I like this move. This is justified now because white doesn't have bishop e3 anymore. You need to notice these little details. Also, of course, after queen b6, it's more difficult for white to push f4. So queen d2, of course, white just follows up with the plan. Go rook d1. Now we need to develop the pieces. Bishop d7, rook d1, rook d8. So both sides finish the development. White has a little bit more space, but we have an easy game. We can go, let's say, knight g6, h6, bishop f8. These are all useful moves. It's always good to know the plans in the position, just not to, so that you don't need to calculate move by move. You just know what you can play. And black won a nice game in Zhu against Yu Yangdi, played in China 2018. Yeah, I like black's position here because all the pieces are on the board, and I feel that black's position has a lot of potential. h3 is the main move to just prepare f4. And we go bishop d7. We need to finish the development. This is the square available for the bishop. But it's good because now our rooks are connected. White goes for it. f4, knight g6, queen f3. Yeah, white is trying to finish the development, but now there are ideas of d5. And we need to do this straight away. If we delay it, white will get the pieces on better squares. And we'll consolidate the space advantage, and we may just land into a position without counterplay, which is what we try to avoid. E5 is forced, and here it's good to remember this detail. Just bishop b4 to pin the knight. Of course, bishop c5 looks more tempting, but white has bishop e3 here to counter the pin. So we first go bishop b4. And the pin on this knight is annoying. White has to do something about it, and bishop b2 is the good move. Instead, bishop d2 doesn't work because of queen b6. queen f2, then knight h5, and there is no way to stop knight takes h4. Quite a rare situation, but you can see that uh, white's pieces are really pinned. So yeah, it's a very nice position. So white has to go bishop b2 to protect the knight on c3, but now we can fall back with the bishop to c5, and white doesn't have bishop e3 available. And we get good counterplay. D4 knight is under attack. Let's see how the play could continue. Queen f2, let's say, bishop d4, queen d4, and now knight h5. Attacking on f4. It's very important that white doesn't have g3. White goes queen e2, and now queen h4. Again, white doesn't have g3. And there is a threat on f4. Now let's see bishop a2, which is a prophylactic move. The play will be similar to the lines with the h3. Again, we stick to our plan. After we played a5, we just take on d4. Here we're going to see knight d4 and queen d4. But queen d4 is not really dangerous because now we can go knight c5. And we're going to play bishop e6 when white spent the tempo on bishop a2. So knight d4 is the principal move. And again, knight c5. The idea is to go bishop e6, of course. Now we're going to see bishop f4 and queen f3. Just to mention that h3 would transpose to the lines with the 9h3. So queen f3 was tried sometimes, but it doesn't give white an advantage. And here we can just go bishop e6. Typical reply. White can try knight f5. This is what was preparing with queen f3 to land this knight on f5. And yeah, we need to get rid of this knight. This knight is creating a lot of threats. We don't want to see a knight on f5. Queen f5 is forced. Otherwise, if it takes with the pawn, we have d5 with really great strategical position. So queen f5. And now queen b6, just to keep an eye on the b2 pawn and not allow white to develop freely. Rook b1. White really wants to develop the c1 bishop. And now we can activate the queen on with queen b4. The threat is knight a4. White goes bishop d2. And we bring the last piece into play, rook a e8. And here black has a good position. Okay, first of all, I want to mention that knight a4 here is not a good move because white can go e5. And white is winning here. You can see now the knight on a4 is misplaced, queen is misplaced, and white has very active pieces. So we need to, that's why we need to bring the rook to e8. And here e5 is not as strong as before. We can just take queen e5, bishop d8, queen d6, and knight fd7, and the position is equal. So now let's see bishop f4. This makes a lot of sense. White is trying to put pressure on d6. And here we have this maneuver. We want to play bishop e6, but first of all, we want to take white's optional. Uh, we don't want white to control the h5 square, so we go bishop g4 first. We can include this, and then the bishop will fall back to e6. Um, just to show you, bishop e6 is not so good here because white can take knight e6, f e6, and e5. Now this works for white because we don't have knight h5. So we want to have knight h5. That's why we go bishop g4. And here we're going to see f3 and queen d2. f3, okay, attacks with the bishop, defends the e4 pawn, but it creates some weakness there. Long term, the e7, g1 diagonal. The bishop goes to e6 as planned. Um, Bishop g3 makes sense here to slightly improve the bishop's position. Sometimes the bishop can go to f2 to secure that diagonal. Now we can go knight h5, bishop f2, bishop a2 also looks like a good idea just to misplace white's rook, rook a2. And here it's important after we traded the light squared bishop, white has ideas to jump to f5. We need to play g6 and control the f5 square. And black is fine here. The rook on a2 is slightly misplaced. It will take some time to bring it back into play. We managed to trade the light squared bishops. So we got some achievements in the position. Queen d2 looks more natural because the bishop will not stay on g4, and later on maybe white can bring that rook to d1. But now bishop e6 works. And we're going to see knight e6. This is how white was getting an advantage with the queen on d1. So we need to see this line here as well. Rook a d1. There is bishop a2. And here white can play for a trap just to ignore the bishop there and go knight f5. This knight on f5 means trouble for us. It's very dangerous, creates a lot of threats. G7, and there's maybe knight e7 with bishop d6. So we need to be very careful here, but black is fine after rook e8. So white can try to go for this trap, but it doesn't really work. Black is okay there. Now let's see knight e6, f takes e6, and okay, now we want to consolidate with d5. And this bishop on a2 would be misplaced, so white has to react with e5. And here we can see the benefit of including bishop g4. Knight h5 is possible, hitting the f4 bishop. The bishop falls back to e3, and we take the pawn on e5. Well, it's not the best pawn up, but it's still a pawn up, and now we want to bring the back knight into play because the knight did its job, and we want to play knight f6, knight e5, and to further consolidate the position. And here, of course, black is fine. Now let's see bishop f1. This can also be tried, and it makes some sense once you played rook e1 to have the bishop there. In In some cases, white could even fianchetto the bishop with later on with g3, bishop g2. But such a move is not so impressive, I think. Rook e8 we go. This is useful move, and now we don't need to worry about the weakness on f7 since the bishop retreated. h3, white is preparing bishop e3, or even sometimes g3 and bishop g2. Now it's fine to take on d4, knight d4, queen d4. There is knight c5 and black is fine. Again, here there is no bishop f4 because of knight e6. So knight d4, let's say, and now knight c5, it transposes to 9h3. Yeah, here a move like bishop g5 just looks active, but actually is not doing much. We can just go h6, and it's not that the bishop on this h48 diagonal is quite misplaced in the Philidor. And finally, let's see h3. This is a logical move. White is preparing bishop e3, and here white made all the good prophylactic moves, a4, rook e1, h3. And here it's time to take on d4, e takes d4. And of course, we're going to see both knight d4 and queen takes d4. First of all, we start with the knight takes d4. White has a threat to go knight f5. We have to stop that. So we just go knight c5. This is the typical move. We are playing this in many similar situations. And the idea is to go bishop e6 to trade the light squared bishop. And sometimes we can even consider rook e8 to activate the rook. And here there are many moves. There is queen f3 to go knight f5. There is bishop a2, bishop f1, b3, and finally bishop f4. So of course white has many options. Queen f3, the point is to play knight f5, and then white will be able to recapture on f5 with the queen. We just continue our plan with bishop e6, and we want to trade the bishops. Now white should probably go bishop f1 to avoid the bishop trade, but if b3, for example, we're not in a hurry to take on c4, we can just go rook e8, which is a useful move. Also, if white takes with the knight on e6, we can just take with the pawn and then follow up with d5. So the move should be bishop f1. And now we can immediately break in the center with d5 because all our pieces are on good positions. It's also possible not to do this and play rook e8 with a solid position. However, let's see d5. White should take on d5. If e5, then knight fd7 and black is fine. It's now we get this strong pawn chain, c6 and d5, and it's not easy for white to push the pawn to f4. So e takes d5, knight takes d5. This is forced. And knight takes e6, white has to do something with this. It takes our bishop pair and also damaging our pawn structure, but we take with the pawn. Now our rook will be active. Queen g4. The queen is active there and also is looking at the e6 pawn. And here we can just continue with bishop d6, then queen f6 or queen c7. We don't want to take on c3 because we like this knight on d5. If we take on c3, white would be much better, but of course, like this with the knight on d5, if white takes on d5, then our pawn structure will be great. So this is queen f3. Now let's see bishop a2. This is a prophylactic move, but again, we can go for the same plan. I like the situations where our usual plan just works and we get good positions with it. So bishop e6, and here we're going to see the main moves knight e6 and bishop e6. I'll discuss briefly queen f3, but then we can take on a2, rook a2, and it's important, again, whenever we trade this bishop and there is a knight on d4, it's important to include the move g6 to control f5 square. So that is good for black. Also, I could try bishop f4 here. Bishop takes a2. Again, we want to trade the bishops and misplace the white rook. Afterwards, we are ready to push g6, but here white can try to play for a trap with knight f5. However, here we have rook e8 and black is fine. Knight f5 was creating all kind of threats. Knight e7, bishop d6. Also, the bishop was attacked, but rook e8 just solves all this. So let's see first bishop takes e6. This shouldn't be very good for white because white wasted the tempo on bishop a2. And now the bishop goes to e6. F takes e6 and now e5. And this is the point at least to damage our pawn structure. We take it, d takes e5, rook e5, and we're activating the bishop with bishop d6. Next, we want to go maybe knight d5 to open up the f file, activate the knight as well. And here it's tempting for white to go for tricks, to play this rook e6, counting on knight e6, knight e6, and then there is a fork. All this is fine, but we can just ignore the rook. The rook is not really threatening anything, only took a pawn. Queen c7 is good here, and we're going for counterplay. We want to include our rook to d8 on the open file. Also, bishop e5 is an idea. Bishop h2 can be considered as well. So black has very good compensation for the sacrifice pawn here. And now let's see, knight takes e6. This makes more sense, it's more principled in my view, because white played bishop c4, bishop a2. So now at least to keep the light squared bishop, we take f takes e6. And I think the principled move is e5. Otherwise, if after, let's say, bishop e3, some developing move, then just d5 and Bishop on a2 is out of play, and we got a nice pawn structure, and already black is preferable here. So e5, we have to take it. D takes e5, queen takes d8. White wants to take on e5 afterwards. Rook d8, rook takes e5, and knight d5. We get this knight in the center. It's not easy for white to attack the pawn on e6, and we have very active knights, especially the knight on d5, but also knight on c5 looks good. Later on, we can also activate the bishop. And for a practical game, I think black has very nice position here. It's more difficult to play this with white. And now let's see bishop f1, which makes some sense because white has the rook on e1. This is a prophylactic move. White is anticipating bishop e6. Here we can go rook e8. No need for bishop e6 anymore, but rook e8 is always a useful move. And we keep options to go bishop f8 or maybe even bishop e6. Just to see what white does next. G3 looks like a logical plan to fianchetto the bishop. If bishop f4, we can go bishop e6, and the same goes for queen f3, again bishop e6. And this is fine for black. So let's see the fianchetto. G3, bishop f8, bishop g2. White is, with this fianchetto bishop, white is just in time to defend the e4 pawn. But now, since white is not attacking the d6 pawn, we can also fianchetto our own bishop with g6, and the bishop will be fine on the long diagonal. Again, it's a playable position for both sides here. Now let's see b3. Again, a prophylactic move. White wants to go bishop b2 or even bishop a3. And here we continue our idea with bishop e6. We want to maybe take on c4 and double the pawns. So white goes bishop f1. If bishop e6, we take back with the pawn. F takes e6 and black is fine. So let's say bishop f1, and but here again, all our pieces are on good positions, and we can go d5. This is a typical break in the center, and after e takes d5, knight d5, we finish the development. We managed to break the center, so white doesn't have a space advantage anymore. If white takes on e6, then we take with the pawn, and our active pieces will compensate for the bishop pair and the slightly worse pawn structure. And bishop f4 is the main move. White is immediately putting some pressure on the d6 pawn. Also, Wesley So in his course recommends this move. And again, we follow our idea with bishop e6. And if white takes on e6, we want to take with a pawn to reinforce the center. And here we're going to see bishop e6, knight e6, of course, all the captures, and also bishop f1 or even queen e2. Bishop e6, f takes e6, and okay, now we open the f file. I think white has to try here to do something quickly. So e5 in order to spoil our pawn structure. The knight goes to d5. Okay, e takes e6 is the move. If knight d5, just e d5. And okay, we have a very nice center for free. So e d6 should be the move. Knight f4. Now this knight on f4 is great. It can also create threats on the white king. D takes e7, queen e7. I think white needs to cover up his king with queen g4. But now he can play rook f6. And we can bring the other rook to f8. Rook g6 also. Right now, if you're into tactics, you probably notice that we are threatening knight g2. And okay, white has the better pawn structure, but we have so many threats here. And already I prefer black's position. Black is a bit better and white has to defend. Bishop f1. This is always an option. This can be considered just to keep more pieces on the board since white has a slight space advantage. And here we can prepare d5 with rook e8. We know by now that this is a very useful move for us. Knight takes e6, just to show black's idea. If queen f3, then there is d5 and black managed to equalize. So knight takes e6. And here, since we have the rook on e8, we don't want to open up the f file anymore. But instead we can take with the knight. And black has a good game here. We can follow up. Okay, first of all, the bishop on f4 is under attack. And then we can go maybe queen b6, bishop f8, and so on. Maybe bring the rook to d8. Queen e2. This was tried by Vashia Lagrave in the Olympiad. Okay, we just take on c4, queen takes c4. And again, whenever we trade the light squared bishops and there is a knight on d4, we shouldn't forget about the knight f5 threat. So we go g6 just to cover that. Knight b3, white is trying to exchange our strong knight on c5. We can go knight e6, especially since it's with tempo. Bishop h2. Queen b6. This makes room for a rook to go to d8. And rook a d1. And until here it was Vacher Lagrave against Vidugov, played in the Chess Olympiad in Budapest 2024. I think in that game black went on with queen b4 and so on, but it just seems easier to play rook fd8 to defend the d6 pawn, and the position is equal. Of course, we have options to push d5 at the right moment. We're not in a hurry to do this, but I think rook fd8 is a good inclusion. And now, finally, let's see knight takes e6. This is the main move. White takes the bishop pair. We take with the f pawn. So when we have the rook on the f file, we want to take with the f pawn, and now we are threatening d5 with a nice pawn wedge in the center. And here we're going to see e5 and bishop d6. All these moves are aimed at destroying our knight's center. If white instead goes queen e2, just not to allow us to go d5 because the e7 bishop may be hanging. But here we can go knight fd7, and black is fine. So let's see, bishop takes d6. White is going to take... okay, white is temporarily sacrificing a piece, but it's going to take it back with e5. I think it's good to trade the queens here, but bishop d6 is also possible. But let's say we just trade the queens. White is forced to take. And bishop takes, and now e5. This was the point to take back the piece. And now the easiest, I think, is knight d5. E takes d6, and this move, rook f4. Simply activating the rook, and we're stopping with tempo, attacking on c4, and we're stopping white from going knight e4. The d6 pawn is not going anywhere. We can take it with rook d8, rook d6. If white takes on d5, then we'll get a very nice structure. So here the position is about equal. And the other move is, of course, e5. Trying to spoil our pawn structure. And here, knight fd7 is the good move. It may look tempting to go knight d5. I mean, if you don't remember exactly, knight d5 can look tempting just to keep the knight central, but this can be refuted with bishop e5, e d5, and then knight d5. So white has some tricks, especially since we have the king on g8. And we take c d5, e d6. Yeah, but now queen d5 will come with tempo. So rook f4, queen d5, king h8, and rook e7. And white is winning here. Okay, we're still a piece up, this knight on c5. But white is very active, and this rook is tremendously strong. The pawn on d6. Also, white could create threats on our king. So we really need to avoid this. It's good to remember this. So just go knight fd7, which is fine. E takes e6, this is forced, and now rook takes f4. D takes e7, queen e7. Now white defends the bishop with queen e2, and also start getting the e6 pawn. Here I like rook a f8 just to double the rooks. It seems very natural to me, and also put some pressure on the f2 pawn. White doesn't get anything from taking on e6 because we can just take everything and then f2 pawn is hanging. So it's better off to go f3. Okay, let me just show you. So for example, white takes, we can take, I don't know, queen takes, knight takes, rook takes, but then there is rook f2 and we're good. So f3, white defends the pawn and now renews the threat of bishop e6. We can go rook h f6, rook 8 f6, just to keep the pieces active. This rook on f4 is active. Now we defended the e6 pawn. And I think black has good play here for the which fully compensate the slightly worse pawn structure. And I'm going to continue the line here because it was given in by Wesley So in his course E4 Part 1. So he's saying B3 there just to secure the A4 pawn, which makes sense. It's a good move. But now we can go knight B6. We're hitting the bishop, and the knight is also heading towards D5. Bishop D3, then knight D5. All these moves are very logical. 94, I think this is the only try to play for an advantage. If 95, of course, he takes d5, and then we have a nice center. So 94, we can trade bishop e4. And here in his course, Wesley So um, offers only queen c7 for black. But actually, I think the easiest is to go knight c3 with this fork. Also, there's an idea to go queen c5 check afterwards. So white is tapping this with queen c4. White is tapping queen c5. Now we can simplify the position taking on e4, rook e4, and queen d6. And we only have one weakness, this e6 pawn, but we have active pieces, and I wouldn't be worried here with the black. For now, there is also this threat of rook f3, and if g takes f3, then queen g3 check. So I think the position is equal here. And this was knight takes d4. Now let's see queen d4. This is an ambitious move because it will be easier for white to bring a rook to d1 after bishop f4. And once this concept is applied, then we could be in trouble because of the d6 pawn. So we need to act quickly, of course. And the move we are recommending in the course is knight b6. It will have a surprise effect because it's quite a rare idea. We are attacking the c4 bishop, and we want to follow up with d5. In most of the games, knight c5 was played, but then white goes bishop f4. So I like this move, knight b6. And here we're going to see bishop a2, bishop b3, and bishop a2. Obviously, white needs to keep the bishop on the long diagonal to prevent our d5. Let's start with bishop b3, trying to keep the bishop more active there. And this looks very natural. But here it's important to switch to the plan with knight fd7. The knight wants to go to c5. And it's very important that we get this with tempo since the bishop is on b3. I want to mention that the move recommended against bishop a2, this d5, doesn't work anymore. And let me show you why. E takes d5, knight fd5, knight d5, knight d5. But now white doesn't take on d5. If white takes on d5, it would transpose, but bishop f4 is strong here. We go bishop f6, bishop e5, bishop e6, rook a d1. You can see that white is very well centralized with the pieces. So bishop e5, queen e5. This is very similar to a line I'm going to show you in a moment, but with the bishop on a2. And with the bishop on a2, it works, but here black is in trouble. So queen b8, and now white has knight d4. And there the saving option was to go knight c3. I think taking on e5 and knight c3. But here the bishop on b3 is defended, so the trick doesn't work, and we're suddenly only with bad pieces. The bishop is under attack, the knight is under attack, so yeah, definitely don't go for this. And this is important, just remember, if bishop goes to b3, switch to knight f7 plan. And bishop f4, now knight c5. This is our idea, and the tempo we're gaining on attacking the b3 bishop is actually very important. Okay, we're going to check bishop a2 and queen e3. It looks very natural to save the bishop with bishop a2, but white wasted one move. And now we can go knight e6, this fork, which will ensure that we'll get a bishop for the knight. Also, bishop e6 is fine, of course, with an extra tempo. Black has a good position. But knight e6, let's say, bishop e6, and here f takes e6 is the more precise recapture, because we are attacking the f4 bishop, and then we want to go e5, bishop e6, and so on. Bishop e3, white is gaining a tempo on the b6 knight, but then we can just retreat the knight. And I think it's good to keep these pawns flexible like this. We have this idea to continue with queen e8, maybe queen h5. And this happened in the game Pastor against Leon, played in Aika. I think it was a rapid game in 2024. Rapid or Blitz. So just to mention that if white tries to play e5, is backfire badly because of the exchange sacrifice, rook f3, gf3, knight e5, and black is winning. I mean, I can hardly call this an exchange sacrifice when the compensation we get is tremendous. So this was bishop a2, but it doesn't make much sense to lose the tempo of the bishop. Now let's see queen e3. This is the only way for white to fight for a small advantage. The idea is to bring the knight to d4. We just get rid of the bishop. That was a strong bishop, and we're happy, of course, to trade some pieces. C takes b3. Now rook e8. Also, it's inspiring to put the rook on the e file. Maybe something will come out of it. White goes rook a d1, bringing the last piece into play. There is a threat of bishop d6 and e5 because of the pin on the d file. But we can go d5 here, and like this we're defending against the that bishop d6 stuff. And we are opening up the position. And yeah, okay, here we have the bishop pair, so it's good to open the position. On the other hand, the position is probably quite concrete since white has both rooks on the open files. But this was tried in a correspondence game, Baltar against Diaz Castagnet, played in ICCF 2024. And black didn't experience problems. So just let me show you some sample lines here because it's a sharp position. So let's say bishop e5, there is bishop e6. And then if bishop d4 to attack the knight on b6, we have rook a6. Very strong move. It's important to keep the knight on b6. Actually, the knight on b6 is not so good, but in this instance, is defending the pawn on d5. So that's why we need to keep it there. But we have this resource rook a6. This was played in the correspondence game, actually. Um, Another possible line is e takes d5. And here we need to trade this knight. It's a good idea because I think the knight is only supporting the b5 push, but because of the pawn on b3, the knight is misplaced otherwise. So why not get rid of it? Knight d5, cd5, queen d3, and then bishop e6, and again black is fine. We managed to defend the pawn, and okay. Also white has a worse pawn structure. The position should be about equal. And now let's see bishop a2. This is actually more accurate than bishop b3. And intuitively, players just drop the bishop back to a2 so as not to so as the bishop is not exposed. And we need to break the center right away before white has time to consolidate. For example, bishop e3 would be one of white's threats. Then the knight is attacked, and then rook ad1, and then of course the push d5 doesn't work so well. So this is the moment. E takes d5. Now, okay, it doesn't really matter. We're going to take on d5 with a knight, but it doesn't really matter which knight. So knight fd5 is the move we've given in the cards, but knight bd5 just leads to the same thing. White is going to trade a pair of knights anyway. So knight fd5, knight d5, knight d5. All this is forced. And now usually in over the board games, white just takes bishop d5 to create an isolated pawn, and afterwards is hoping to exploit that weakness. But there is also an interesting move, bishop f4. Bishop f4 was not tried in over the board games. It makes sense because now white delays the trade on d5. However, there is a threat to go bishop e5, and of course you can see all white's pieces are very active. We go bishop f6 to activate our bishop. Bishop e5, of course, this was the point. And now we need to reinforce the knight on d5 with bishop e6. White brings the last piece into play, rook ad1. I don't think white achieves anything with the bishop f6 because of queen f6, and here pawn takes f6. But okay, we have this worse pawn structure with f6 and f7, but I don't see how white can take advantage of it. So the endgame is fine for black. But rook ad1 is much more ambitious because now white has an advantage in development since he managed to bring the rooks on the open files. Yeah, here we need to be precise. I think black is fine, but we need to be precise. So we start by trading some pieces. Bishop takes e5. And then queen takes e5. If rook e5, um, white would have this threat of knight g5. So it's good to go h6. But now white cannot attack the e6 bishop with the knight, so this is fine. Anyway, I think h6 is a useful move, so this is fine for us. Queen e5 is um, more direct, and now there is a threat of c4, of course, to win a piece. And another precise move here is queen b8, offering a queen trade. And I was referring to this line with the bishop on b3. There it worked just fine for white. White had an advantage there, but now with the bishop on e2, we're going to see it's a big difference. And actually, uh, black doesn't have problems here. And now the most principled, let's say, is knight d4, but then we can take on e5, queen e5, rook e5, and knight c3. Very nice idea, and the position is about equal, I think, afterwards. So it's important that the bishop is hanging on a2. With the bishop on b3, all this would not be possible. But of course, white would most likely like to take on d5 just to create that isolated pawn. We take back with the pawn, and now we're going to check queen d3 and bishop f4. Queen d3 is a clever move. It's preventing us from going bishop f5. It was tried in a couple of games. Here I like this idea to activate the rook on the 6th rank with rook a6. The rook can go to g6, for example, to create some threats. Nothing serious, but just small weaknesses. White should probably finish the development with bishop f4, then to follow up with rook a d1 and rook g6 here. Again, for now there is a threat of bishop h3, but that can easily be parried. However, afterwards we can fall back with the rook to e6, and maybe bishop c5 could be an idea afterwards. We have the bishop pair, and I think this compensates for the isolated pawn. Bishop f4 is the most played move in this position, just to develop the bishop. And now we also develop the bishop to f5, hitting the c2 pawn. Now, okay, we're going to see queen d2 and c3, both ideas to defend the c2 pawn. So queen d2, here white has the idea to bring the knight to d4. We can activate the bishop to e4. I like this. Knight d4. This was played in Burkic against Leon in Mali, Losin, 2024. And I think Leon put the bishop on this diagonal, bishop f6, but I very much prefer the bishop on c5. I think it's much stronger like this, and black can follow up with queen b6. So let's say knight b5. This is nice place for the knight, but it's not threatening so much. Instead, if bishop e3, we just follow all the same with queen b6. So knight b5, and now queen b6. This was our idea. Then queen could jump also to g6, creating threats on the king side. White is trading the bishops, hoping to get better control of a d4 square later on, and to try to make use of the d5 pawn. But here I like this move, queen g6. There is a double attack on g2 and c2, and the endgame is is equal here. Note that the bishop on e4 is very strong, and it not only defends the pawn on d5, but also helps in creating threats on both lines, like here on g2 and c2. c3 is the other way to protect the pawn, and now white wants to go rook a d1, next move. And again, we are activating this rook on the 6th rank. And here we're going to see queen e3 and rook a d1. Queen e3 is a direct approach. Of course, there is a threat of queen e7, but it can easily be parried. Rook e8 is the good move. Of course, much more tempting is to go rook e6 because it's with tempo, but then the white queen can infiltrate to a7. And we need to avoid this. So rook e8, apparently now we are under some pin. We cannot move the bishop, but we don't want to move the bishop, and white also doesn't have queen a7. Knight d4, let's say white activates the knight, but then bishop d7, and now the rook is defended, the e8 rook. We can move the bishop if we want. Also, we keep an eye on the a4 pawn with this move. And here we can go bishop c5, rook g6, and I think the bishop pair fully compensate for the isolated pawn. Rook a d1. This is there is a threat to take queen d5. We can play bishop e4. Again, the bishop is well placed there. We're defending the d5 pawn. And white goes knight e5 just to centralize the knight and maybe go c4. This is the idea. But here, okay, we're not impressed with these threats. Just go h6, slowly improving the position. This move h6 is going to be useful on the long term. And white's idea is not so dangerous because we have the this important move bishop c2. It comes with tempo, attacking the rook. And now, okay, it depends where the rook goes, but we can, if the bishop is not attacked, we can take on c4, or else we can take on a4. And the position is equal, and there will be some, it will simplify. Okay, so just to recap, here are the, in this chapter we talked about the lines with c6. There is this simple idea to first improve a little bit our position and only then take on d4. After c6, we already want to take on d4, but in some lines we can include a5 first. However, we don't want to maneuver the pieces too much around. We still want to take on d4 as soon as possible. And we covered, I covered in this video all kind of moves. Basically, rook e1 is the main move, and it makes sense. Now we go a5, and here again there are many possibilities. I think h3 is again the main option. We take on d4, and here both this there is knight d4 with knight c5. Most of the times, if not all the times, the knight goes to c5, and bishop f4, bishop e6. This is the idea to follow up with bishop e6. I think black is doing well here. And queen d4 is probably the main move, with bishop f4 and rook d1. But we have this idea which will likely surprise your opponent. Knight b6 here. You need to remember that if bishop b3, there is knight f d7. And if bishop a2, we go d5, and we will get this isolated pawn position. But black has enough resources here. Bishop f5 is an idea. Rook a6 is an idea. And usually later on, if white moves the queen, I prefer the bishop on this diagonal. Bishop to c5 on the a7 g1 diagonal. Thank you for watching.